Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Today we have with us Vanessa Beeley, returning all-star guest, and she's coming from Syria. She's joining us all the way from Syria. So, how are you doing, Vanessa?
Is that question?
That's a tough question.
I really don't know how to answer it these days. As I said before we started, I guess I just feel nobody should be okay while what is happening in Palestine is happening. Nothing should be okay in this world when we just on a live stream 24/7 basis see kids being eviscerated and decapitated and massacred and tortured and abused and raped and an entire generation of Palestinians wiped out in the last 9 months, and it's not stopping. Nothing is stopping it. No, nobody, apart from the resistance factions.
Yeah, totally agree. But nonstop hatred and racism, and it's unbelievable that this can happen in broad daylight after years and years of indoctrination about not allowing these things to happen by the very people who've been indoctrinating us to prevent these things. So
there was a video yesterday actually which I found really shocking, and somebody tweeted out if the Zionists don't want to be compared to Nazis, they should stop behaving like Nazis. And there was this video of the death of a boy that was literally dying from malnutrition, and that kind of skeletal, twisted little body. It's like all the images that have haunted all of us about the Nazi recriminations, not only against Jews, but also against Romanies, against communists, against, as part of their entire ethno-supremacist pogroms. But we're seeing exactly the same thing again. But the extraordinary thing is we're just not getting the same reaction. Why? Because the media is not being instructed, of course, really, I think Floyd in the US got more sympathy over a period of time than the Gazans have had, honestly.
Yeah.
Because the media, because whenever the media steps in and actually amplifies something, then people's empathy is triggered. But, yes, there have been protests. But it's not stopping. This is the point.
I think bringing up the Black Lives Matter is interesting because what on the executive level of the media, why did they decide to push that so hard? And why are they not pushing this? I mean, I think there's good questions to ask. And some of that factors into what we saw potentially happen in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's very hard to know what exactly happened in the apparent Trump assassination. But a few things we can be sure of, and you're one of the only voices I've heard mentioning this, is that if you truly wanted to assassinate Donald Trump, you would not pick a mentally deranged, just fresh out of high school guy who didn't really shoot well. That's not the choice. And you also wouldn't have him openly walk across a roof so that everyone could see him. You would hide him in a window or something. So, and give him a better gun. He had a gun that isn't suited for long distance shooting. I mean, you can make a shot with an AR-15 like that, but that is not the choice weapon for that. So there's a lot of questions when all the alternative media is jumping on, it was an actual assassination attempt that the deep state wanted to happen. For me, that seems like they wanted us all to have that narrative. So obvious that plays into the Trump supporter, idea that Trump is against the deep state when we all know he was just as deep statey as any other politician. He just ran with this concept of being against the deep state. And now we're all supposed to believe that there's a deep state assassination. It's very easy to see that we should believe that. But then if you think of it rationally, you come to the conclusion that maybe it was supposed to seem like that. And maybe is it supposed to be a way of boosting Trump, giving him like the blessings from God, being like an anointed horseman of the apocalypse coming in to launch a huge, massive war. And I think how I connect this to George Floyd is that I think the Black Lives Matter protests may have also been a kind of seeding of future social behavior where you have a divisive, for example, Trump's supporters now look at Palestinian protesters as if they are Black Lives Matter protesters. And we all know what Black Lives Matter protesters got away with, burning down whole city blocks and just running havoc. And so there is no way for a Trump supporter to look at the Palestinian protests and say, oh, well, they're also fighting for America first. They're also saying we should get rid of, Israeli occupation of American politics and stop funding genocide and focus on America. You can't make that connection because now we've been seeded a couple years ago with the idea that left-wing protests are psychotic. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Hear your response.
I think, in any of these events, and I think I was pretty fast on X, whatever it is, to kind of say, people, this is a psyop. I'm not interested in going into the kind of what gun he had, whether there was 2 shooters, 1 shooter, blah, blah, blah. Other people are way better at doing this kind of OSINT stuff than I am. But for me, it's like you always have to look at the direction of travel. What is achieved? Who gains by whatever event takes place? Right? And as soon as I saw this event, one, the iconic image, of Trump recovering himself from the ground with this kind of already dried blood on his ear, which is virtually impossible because I've cut the same area of my ear and it does not stop bleeding for hours. I mean, around 12 hours it was still bleeding, and I only had like a tiny little scissor nick. But the blood was already dry when he stood up. 1, 2, there's a shooter out there. There's potentially more shooters, but they allow him to basically give another headshot by the way he stood up, right? Which in security terms is ridiculous. You don't do that. He's smothered and he's taken out. And then the fact that this image within 8 hours was appearing on T-shirts and memes on Twitter, and there was a whole raft of kind of, I would say, Republican followers who were suddenly picking this up and running with it to a degree that was completely exclusive to any discussion on what else might have actually happened. I'm not going to name any names, but they were big names in the Republican camp on social media that uniformly just accepted it as being an assassination attempt, right? Then you started to get, as you rightly said, this kind of, what was it, Megyn Kelly kind of saying, did you see the time and date that Trump was almost assassinated? This is according to Psalm XYZ. I am not a theologian, and I'm not going to get involved into that either. But when you look at what's happening in the Middle East, and Joe Biden has been providing the bombs. America, AIPAC, the billionaire complex has been providing the bombs because that's what makes them money to obliterate Gaza and to, as we say, probably kill way more than 200,000 people in Gaza. I mean, the numbers, I think, are even the latest Lancet survey, which says 186,000, in my opinion, is way too low. Biden can be considered or analyzed as having kind of dragged his feet a little bit, like he froze the delivery of some of the £2,000 bombs until, of course, he allowed them in and they bombed Al-Mawazi camp with them. But Trump, I mean, Trump in the Middle East, I mean, I get this all the time. People say to me, yeah, but he didn't start any wars. I said, did he end any? Did he end any? Or did he actually increase the suffering of the people that had been subjected to war for decades? Like, war isn't necessarily, we live in the age of hybrid war. We live in the age of multi-spectrum war. It doesn't have to be a bomb-dropping war. Trump basically in Syria brought in all of the economic measures that every single Syrian will tell you it's worse than living under the mortars, living under US occupation of resources, and then living under the Caesar sanctions that Trump brought in. And Trump brought in the Abraham Accords, which is effectively the seal of approval on Greater Israel. Because if you look at the normalized nations, you have Greater Israel. The only thing that is missing is Syria and Iraq. Because you have Egypt, you have UAE, you have Bahrain, you have Saudi Arabia. So you have most of Jordan. Look at the map of Greater Israel. The Abraham Accords is what succeeded in giving Netanyahu Greater Israel.
Right.
But people, he wanted to give Jerusalem to Israel. They wanted to call it Trump Heights in Golan because he said, why are we campaigning against Israel being allowed to keep the Golan territories? But people forget this. It's like it's like kind of goldfish policy, in America. It's like in 2021 or in when was he actually elected? 2021. They wanted Trump because X was so bad. Mm-hmm. Then, when they had Trump for 4 years, they wanted Biden because Trump was so bad. Now they've had Biden for 4 years, and they want Trump because Biden was so bad.
That's America.
Yeah, it's like, but it's how Americans still believe in this duopoly. They still believe that voting for Republican or Democrat is going to make a difference. And this whole America First thing, which is just exceptionalism under another brand, because ultimately what it means is putting America first, which means who cares about the brown people that are getting bombed and obliterated and exterminated, as long as we stop nuclear war with Ukraine, with Russia, which they're not going to do. I mean, Pompeo's initial kind of proposal for a peace deal is ridiculous. It's absolutely no different to the current NATO plan, basically. So, I'm at a loss because I've even had people say to me, yeah, but Palestine isn't the only issue. I'm like, how can it not be the number one issue? You have been destroying and plundering and alienating the entire global south since you were established on genocide. I mean, America is effectively another settler state. Yeah. Sorry, I've just really kind of I've had it at the moment because I live in Syria, etc. You live in Iran. Iran is under devastating sanctions, but at least you have control of your resources. Syria doesn't have control of anything.
It's oil, yeah.
That's true. It's crippling. We're back to 24, 48-hour queues for fuel here. The prices are insane. The roads are empty. But, this is irrelevant to people in America, basically. That's the message that I'm getting from the majority of people that are trying to debate with me about, whether they should vote for Trump or Biden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You're voting for the billionaire class. You're voting for the predator class. And that creditor class is not going to care about Americans any more than it cares about brown people in Syria or in Palestine or in Iran or in Venezuela, in any country that stands in its way of taking control of the world resources.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not even benefiting the like Americans either. Like the U.S. population is also, I mean, it's in a very, very different scale, but the U.S. population is also suffering from those policies because we always hear that taxpayers' money is being spent on the war in Ukraine and on supporting and funding in Israel, while people in the U.S., especially over the past few years, are suffering from economic issues, the terrible healthcare system that exists there. So I wanted to ask you, like he said, I mean, Trump has done a lot of terrible things as just being as part of the same war machine that the U.S. is. Not that he's the sole decision maker in those things, but like Iranians know him for responsible for the assassination of General Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, but also terrible sanctions. Like, I mean, we have always been under sanctions by the U.S., but Trump was the one who withdrew from the deal, and then there were more severe sanctions on Iran. But what's something kind of interesting for me is, after the so-called assassination attempt, is that even people from the so-called left or independent journalists they're not talking about it as being the deepest state, but they're talking about lone wolf, like shooter who just thought it's cool to approve his shooting skills by targeting Trump. But I mean, it's really amazing. Like, do you really leave no space for any doubts? Because there are so many things that don't make sense and they don't add up. What do you think is happening there? Like, why are we seeing independent journalists who are very good on a lot of other issues not like understanding this or not wanting to talk about it?
It is very weird. I mean, it is it seems to be like a kind of almost a mass gatekeeping. And what's kind of interesting is what I would term as, the Republican followers are the first ones to call out a conspiracy, like whether it's Sandy Hook, because I mean, Alex Jones. Again, I'm not quite sure how much I believe in his entire court case and so on, because that also struck me as being very theatrical, but whatever. But even he, the only thing, I'm not a big follower, but he put out something talking about the assassination as if it was attempt, as if it were completely de facto, this is what it was, Whereas normally he would be the first one to be calling out the fact that these are crisis actors and so on and so forth. But yeah, you're right. There's I don't know if that's coming from the majority of U.S. independent media, and potentially, I guess, they still believe in this whole two-party system and that there is democracy in the United States and that the elections are not completely rigged in advance and as corrupt as hell. But if they do, then in my opinion, that's not due diligence as a journalist, because you really don't have to kind of, dig very deep to discover what a sham American democracy really is. I mean, and this is the extraordinary thing, we're watching Fiorella Isabel can tell you way more about what's going on in Venezuela, but the way that she describes the electoral process in Venezuela, it's absolutely watertight. I observed the referendum voting in the Donbass in 2022. It was really well managed. If you look at what's just happened in Iran, I mean, a totally kind of democratic process by which the president was elected, right? But of course, this is completely annihilated from any discourse about those countries.
Exactly.
And so this is where I struggle, yes, with many in the kind of left independent media that are kind of buying into this whole narrative of there actually being a choice between Republican and Democrat. And I have seen one or two even slightly kind of distorting Trump's record, which I don't know. I mean, it's kind of, these days I do quite often just sit and scratch my head and I'll just go, I don't understand how people can't see what is going on. I mean, you've only got to look at, for example, J.D. Vance, backed by Peter Thiel, which is Palantir, which is CIA. In his first speech, he's talking about punching Iran and punching hard. Trump has always been the one that had Iran and China in the crosshairs.
Yeah, that's true. I think, you were saying whether it's media, your alternative media, or being obsessed with the party system or what their problem is. I think it just takes like this general skepticism of all these kind of like theatrical events that cause political change. In like, if you just look at, 7/7, 9/11, they're all just these multi-layered events where they have a training exercise that's exploited by another actor that makes it worse than it was originally supposed to be. And then it's so easy to envision a situation in which this kid was just, they knew what he was planning. Yes, he was a lone wolf, but then they then said, okay, we're going to just secretly help this guy. Or maybe some guy reached out to him and said, hey, I can help you with this. And then they always blame it on like intelligence failures or security failures. Whenever you hear that excuse, you should be very suspicious because they don't have those things. Like, if you look at other times when there was a gun brought to a Trump rally and or a security threat at a Trump rally, and watch how fast they take Trump off the stage in those videos of past events. And it's like, there's that is a total lie when they say security failures or intelligence failures. That means they're trying to cover up a multi-layered event where one group of the actors during that event thought they were doing one thing. They're actually being allowed to do that by another group. And that just seems so clear to me. But I think a lot of people don't realize how those events can be structured, and like the sleight of hand that is used to deceive people and make it so. Because if you try and explain this theory to someone, the first thing they're going to say is, oh, so you think like the Secret Service shot those people in the crowd? No, I don't think that. I think the kid shot them, but they let him do it. And they figured out a way to do it in a way in which Trump wasn't threatened. Like when he left his rifle behind the day before, so it wouldn't have to go through security. He apparently stashed it behind the air conditioner there near the building. They didn't find the rifle, which they probably would have otherwise. They probably altered the sight on it. They probably put 223 rounds in it instead of 5.56, which is a slower round, and it wouldn't have threatened the president at all, and it would have shot people in the crowd instead. So it's very easy to explain how those people would have been shot without having anyone doing it other than the shooter. So, but then the question is, who benefits from that? Why would they go to those extents? And I think, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Kamala Harris had a meeting with Netanyahu, and she said, she floated the idea of a ceasefire, and Netanyahu shot her down immediately. So it's like, I think they might have just been afraid of the wild card of Kamala Harris, or whoever might have replaced Biden could be less pro-Zionist. And they knew they had Trump in the cards, and they had J.D. Vance in the cards. What do you think of that when you're trying to just personally try and rationalize what might have been the motivation for giving this apparent assassination?
I mean, I don't think they're worried genuinely about any particular, because they're all captured. I mean, the entire US political system is captured by the Zionist movement, as it is in the UK. So I don't think they worry about any wild card, or because let's remember, Trump was supposed to be a wild card. Didn't see much of that during his 4 years tenure, really. I mean, people still tried to dredge up little things that he did, like people were circulating that video where he walked away without shaking Netanyahu's hand. But then, as people pointed out, yeah, but that's a fake video because they've just cut at that point before he circles back to pump his hand. And I mean, they've just spent time in his Florida resort. But whatever, optics that Kamala Harris is right now trying to put forward, because she's kind of coming in and throwing her hands up in her about, the genocide in Gaza and so on. None of this is real. None of this is real. This is the thing. It's all smoke and mirrors. None of them are genuine in what they say. None of them have a humanitarian bone in their body.
That's true.
Right? They are soulless because all of these people have watched this genocide for 9 months and done nothing. And I think another really important point, because I was watching, the grilling of the head of security, her name escapes me now, but that was also insane, because anyone who is in a position of being the head of that security team is not going to be unable to give the information that she was being asked for.
Right.
But what is really important here, there was a lot of messaging coming out of that grilling, and that messaging was about the safety of all Congress people, right? And so when you start to bring that in, you start with gun controls, the whole control grid comes in. You're back in Patriot Act time. So I think that's another stream of the direction of travel here, is to bring in extra control, extra surveillance. And the thing is, I've been doing a lot of work on the kind of the Unit 8200, the Israeli forces spy unit, and effectively how those that are being trained in Unit 8200 are now fully established in most of the cyber surveillance tech startups in the US and in the UK, and they are controlling everything in our lives with relation to surveillance, right? And I mean, I've been watching recently, there's a couple of, speeches by Netanyahu back in 2017, and I think a bit more recently, talking about how cyber surveillance, cyber warfare is the way forward, and that Israel now effectively, either through infiltration of American companies or through the establishment of 8200 startups in the US and the UK. I mean, for example, in the UK, all of our private, not mine, thank God, because I'm living here, but all private information from the health sector, from the education sector, from the Ministry of Defense sector, is being stored on Oracle. Oracle is a Zionist organization, through and through. They don't employ anyone that doesn't support Israel. So all your private information in the UK and in the US is going onto storage with a Zionist organization. A Zionist organization that is part of a Zionist entity that is committing genocide and is developing all of the AI surveillance structure and punishment structure that potentially is going to be deployed also in the West. And no, that isn't an extremist view. There's a reason that this is being developed. There's a reason that now they're talking about the need for control, the need for extra surveillance, because every single politician in the US is now in danger, because if they can shoot at Trump, they can shoot at anyone. This is a really dangerous narrative now that's being cycled out of this whole kind of interrogation of this security person whose name I still can't remember.
She wasn't fired immediately. That tells you something. I mean, that's like the 9/11 perps. They all kept their jobs and nobody was fired. Yeah. They said it's a failure of intelligence, yet nobody was fired. They said it's a failure of security in this case. If you say it's a failure of security, then you should resign. That's how it works when you say those words. But if those words are said and the people aren't resigning,
No, they're just given a job, like a desk job somewhere else and very well paid. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Or they go and join the Tony Blair Institute. That's where most of them are ending up.
Right. So it's just, that was a huge, because I said that immediately, like the very day I was like, the Secret Service there has to be, layoffs or firings from this, because this is just insane. You would never see this, even in the most, like, unfunded secret services or protection services in, developing countries. You wouldn't see this kind of behavior. This is just like uncalled for clownishness.
I'm pretty sure they got a bonus because, Trump was elevated to kind of godlike status in about 24 hours.
Right.
The messaging that was going out, God saved Trump.
Yeah.
It's just like, and the problem is, if you look at the Trump administration even before, it's jam-packed with Christian Zionists. And if we're going to go down the theology route, then we know that the expansionist Zionists that are led by Netanyahu, if Netanyahu this is what I keep saying to people also, forget about Netanyahu. He's being kind of promoted as the one in charge, promoted as the one whose fault this all is. But you remove the head from the snake, another one's going to come back, and another one, and another one, and another one. Because they all think the same. 80% of the population, and that's conservative, in occupied Palestine, agree with the extermination of Palestinians.
Right.
And this ideology has existed since 1917, since the Zionist movement was established back in the late 1890s. No different. And no different to the Nazi ideology either. They're all ethno-supremacist. But it's the use of this belief that, one, the state of Israel should exist before the second coming, which is not correct according to to Judaism. But then this idea that they've got to create Armageddon in order for the second coming of Christ, right? And people might dismiss this. The reality is that Trump's administration, including Mike Pompeo, is jam-packed full of Christian Zionists who genuinely believe in this. It can't be ignored.
There was a
the whole Temple Mount movement and so on. Sorry, I keep.
Yeah, the Messianic movement is very worrying in this because they want an apocalyptic war. There was an article a couple days ago where Trump was commenting about how the Israelis have such terrible PR because they keep allowing these Jews in their traditional hats to be seen holding Palestinian flags. He was like, that's unbelievable PR. Like, he doesn't understand even the complexities of anti-Zionist Judaism. He doesn't understand that exists. I mean, it's a very, very small number of Jews, but especially within the occupied territories. But so it's politically insignificant. But he doesn't understand why they exist. He thought that it was just like it's like an aberration that the press was reporting these pictures. So I think you're right. I think they just there is a lack of information. But I think one thing, it might not be that the apparent assassination of Trump was supposed to just anoint him and then provide him like political capital over his opponent, but he represents a divisive character for American politics, whereas the liberals don't do that quite as much. And actually, if we had a liberal, like one of the quote unquote liberal Democrat, whatever candidates come in party, there may be more cohesion between right and left individuals in America. But if you have Trump in there, again, you do have a major social divide, which helps you control the people. And a lot of these things you're talking about with Oracle ownership, there's this there's this agenda that operates behind away from the awareness of a lot of American people. Like I just was reminded today that the textbooks of most of the children in America in elementary school, McGraw-Hill, was owned by Robert Maxwell, like a Mossad, one of the most famous Mossad agents in the history of Israel. It was majority share owned by him. So it's like you have Mossad owning the school books for children in America. Like, what do you think they're doing with that? That's not innocent. That wasn't an investment. That was for money, that was an investment for narrative. So there's a lot of narrative stuff happening that we're not aware of.
Oh, absolutely. When you read in depth the kind of alternative narrative that has very much disappeared and always was disappeared. I mean, the British were disappearing, I think, even while Palestine was still under the occupation of the Ottomans. The British were preventing any Palestinians starting up newspapers or speaking about the Zionist movement pre-1917. So the entire Palestinian narratives were being completely disappeared from the beginning. Pre-1917, they were being erased and they were not being given a voice. So, and people have to really go and search for those narratives. That's the problem. Whereas, as you say, when you've got this massive, complex information, mind manipulation complex that is basically the Zionist movement, I mean, they are behind the creation of the term Islamist or Islamic extremist. That was all started by the Zionist movement.
But I like to use the term Jewish extremists because it makes people think of like.
They were extremists. They were terrorists. Yeah. They were the original terrorists. Ergen and Stern gangs, before they kind of morphed into being Haganah, the so-called defense forces, the occupation forces, they were terrorists.
Yeah, they were terrorists. They were funded by the mafia.
Yeah.
Came from.
This is the point. And none of them are from the region. None of them. Most of them are from Ukraine and Slovakia and all over Eastern Europe, mostly. Because, of course, the Jabotinsky movement, which is Netanyahu and a series of Zionist leaders, Jabotinsky was in Ukraine. And he collaborated with Simon Petlura, the first president of the Republic of Ukraine. And Petlura was, an out-and-out Nazi who'd carried out pogroms against Jews and communists and Russians and, And yet for Jabotinsky and Petlura, it was fine to collaborate against Russia at that point.
Kind of like now, right?
Yeah. But this is the point, it's I also, we did it. You should actually have Professor David Miller on because he's extraordinary. His knowledge of what the Zionist movement has achieved
is very good on that. We have had him before for topic on Zionism, but it's a good idea to have him.
Refresh because he's constantly kind of building on his information as well, and it's I just find him fascinating on this because they've had their hand in everything. Fascism, anti-fascism, racism, everything. They've infiltrated everything. The Antifa movement, Tommy Robinson in the UK. All of it is being influenced by the Zionist movement to divide and conquer because that's what they've always done. Look at the clean break doctrine. That's exactly what they were talking about. Dividing the Middle East up into manageable statelets that would collaborate with and be compassionate to the Zionist cause.
Yeah. Well, and here we are today, I guess, in the same mess. It just seems to be like the Zionist project just seems to be banging its head against the wall because it doesn't seem like they have any clear path to victory, and they just have to continue to figure out how to manipulate larger powers to do their wars for them. And I feel like when I saw that story about the assassination, that was my initial reaction. Was like, okay, so now we have the guy who's gonna launch us into a big world war. Like, this is our guy. Like, because now he's been anointed. And yeah, I appreciate you being willing to like say what you feel about it too, because I think a lot of people are just kind of too cowardly to to like discuss options. Because I mean, if you just say you did it this way, it happened this way or that way, then your audience just kind of goes to sleep. But if you allow for like a diversity of possibilities based on, I mean, it's all evidence. We don't have any evidence that's conclusive in any way. We just have what the government says. So yeah, it's good to kind of suss out where the power flows, like you said, like where who benefits.
Direction of travel.
Who benefits?
Yeah. But also the direction of travel. I mean, the thing is that we know, what was it, Robert F. Kennedy talking about why Israel was so important to them, basically to prevent the rise of any other global power, which includes Iran, Russia, China, the freedom of the global south to decide who they sell their oil to. This was anathema to the United States, and he was very clear about this. It was black and white. That's why we have Israel, right? The Indian Middle East Economic Corridor. That's all about shutting out. That's making use of and exploiting the Abraham Accords and the normalization with the Gulf states and Jordan, the absolute decimation of Gaza to create a free trade zone, the manipulation of Egypt into providing the port and the logistics to take products from Mumbai through the Gulf states into occupied territories, through Gaza to El Arish, and then to Europe. Well, this is in direct confrontation, of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative, with various Iranian, Russian, Iraqi projects that are ongoing, but of course have been absolutely sabotaged, particularly by the war against Syria. So this is all about, it's all kind of usual historical story of one empire pitting itself against another. And the problem, and this is where sometimes I just kind of despair. I just think, is this ever going to change? Like, are we ever going to stop doing this? It's an endless cycle, One empire comes to prominence for a couple of 100 years, then it starts to lose its power and so on, and then another empire arises, and that's the one that kind of kicks it off the pedestal, and then you go through that same cycle again.
Or at least experience that happening. I'm not sure anymore with all the ownership in non-state actors' hands. Like, it's mostly private. Most of the wealth's privately owned, so we may just have the appearance of transitioning, but we're actually just still owned by the same oligarchy class, no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, that's also another layer, is the whole transnational oligarchy predator class that, of course, are pulling the strings behind many of the decisions that are ongoing. But I think, and there's a lot of things that China is doing that I find highly questionable. The theft of oil from Yemen, the supply of weapons to Israel, which, okay, this can be happening through Chinese companies, not necessarily through the Chinese state.
Yeah.
But for me, that's just the same as kind of using NGOs to achieve plausible deniability, which is what the West has historically always done, to infiltrate and capture target nations and plunder their resources. I'm not saying China does it in quite the same way as the West. They do invest in infrastructure. But what China has been doing in Yemen is criminal, actually.
Can you describe that?
Well, I mean, basically, since the war against Yemen began in 2015, China has been taking Yemeni oil and paying the Saudi-backed Mansour Hadi government based in Aden in the south. So depriving the National Salvation Government of income, the constitutionally elected Yemeni government, rather than the Western Saudi, Israeli, UAE, Qatari-backed Hadi that had already resigned from his presidency before he fled to Saudi Arabia and demanded that they bomb his own people. But China is basically docking in the southern ports, which are under the control of Al-Qaeda, and the money that China is paying for the oil is going to Saudi Arabia.
Does Ansar Allah not targeting any of those facilities? It seems like.
Oh, yeah, no, they have.
Good.
Yeah, they have. And they've threatened, it's on record that they've threatened China not to continue doing that. So, I think people do look at everything looking for this kind of rose-tinted glasses future. And I think that's sort of foolish, because I think we have to look at the fact that all of these countries, Russia, China, are blossoming empires, let's say, right? And so they're going to be looking at their own national interests first and foremost. China will trade with anyone, provided it's of benefit to China. It recently had this so-called peace brokering exercise with all of the Palestinian factions. But I don't know. I haven't totally wrapped my head around that, but I'm not entirely comfortable with it. I don't know how you feel about that, Sophia, but I haven't gone into it enough, but I just have because there were, I think it was, I can't remember which faction put out a statement saying that the final document was inaccurate because they had actually demanded that the PLO refuse to recognize the state of Israel, and that wasn't included in the document that was released. So, I don't know. I have reservations, let me put it this way. Where I put my faith is with, as you say, the non-state actors across the region who, are doing an incredible job of supporting Palestine. Yemen is number one, just because, they're extraordinary people. I think I'll retire to Yemen. Hezbollah, Syrian territory is being used by all resistance factions to launch attacks, and we're still getting bombed by Israel for that reason. I mean, Syria is the land bridge. Syria is the bridge between Iran and the Palestinian resistance. And we are still here in Syria supplying weapons to the Palestinian resistance as well. We're providing launch pads for Hezbollah, for Islamic resistance in Iraq. Of course, there are other factions also now moving forward in case Lebanon comes under attack. And you mentioned, I think it was yesterday, wasn't it, Majd al-Shams was attacked in the occupied Golan territories. Allegedly, it was reported to have been attacked by Hezbollah. Hezbollah has put out a absolutely categorical denial. And the funeral goers today kicked, what's his name? I call him Beelzebub, and I can never remember his real name. Smotrich, the finance minister. Anyway, we'll do this. Anyway, they kicked him out of the funeral because, it's obvious this was basically an Iron Dome interceptor missile. Yeah.
Well, and they're trying to Israelis are trying to claim those as their own when they're just another occupied people who they exert political force over. I've been to the Golan and they fly Syrian flags there. They don't fly Israeli flags. So, like, it's obvious that they're unhappy with their political
And they
situation.
speak Arabic and Syrian Arabic.
Yeah.
It's just
Well,
so
Mashtal al-Shams, if you come to the Syrian side, the village was actually cut in two by the occupation. And there's a little kind of, it's not really a valley, it's like a gap. And people used to kind of throw things to each other and talk across the gap. It's crazy.
There's a huge Syrian flag on the Israeli controlled side. The Israeli occupied side. And it's like, so the other side can see it. So it's like really, yeah. So it's obvious this is just another occupied people who Israel is willing to kill. And then in the Western media, they try and take ownership of those, like these are Israelis who were killed by Hezbollah, and it's sick. So I'm glad that they didn't allow any Israeli politicians in there. But they were trying to make it sound like it should be a pretext for the U.S. to help launch a war against Hezbollah. That's what it looked like to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was to a degree a false flag, but I mean, it didn't fly very well. And, I keep saying that the Israelis have been threatening to invade Lebanon since October the 7th. And okay, right now the rhetoric is getting a little bit more bombastic. But it's going to be suicide. They can't manage the war in Gaza. The only thing they can do, of course, is to bomb innocent civilians, women, children, elderly, disabled, Down syndrome, deaf people, vulnerable people. And, a war in Lebanon would look very similar because they're not going to engage on the ground with Hezbollah because they know that will be a disaster. So the likelihood is, I don't see it escalating to kind of an all-out blitzkrieg war, but I do see it continuing to edge towards escalation. And ultimately, of course, what will they do? They will target infrastructure. They will try to put pressure on Hezbollah by perhaps targeting closer to Beirut or in areas where they know there is opposition to Hezbollah, for example. Because, Lebanon has been heavily divided. And that's sort of their, forgive the pun, that's kind of their trump card. Is this, if they can trigger some kind of popular uprising against Hezbollah inside Lebanon, and we know that they've been moving troops, NATO troops basically, into Tripoli in the north from Cyprus under the pretext of being able to evacuate citizens from Lebanon if it does kick off with Israel. But the reality is, of course, these are special forces that are now embedded in Tripoli. They've been working from an intelligence perspective inside Tripoli so I was speaking to Radwan Mortada the other day, a journalist who's there, and he said, basically one half is okay. They're pretty solid. But then the rest are pretty much ISIS and Al-Qaeda that came in from Syria. So, of course, they've been infiltrated by particularly British intelligence.
Yeah.
So it's complex. It is very complex. And that's what, in my opinion, Iran and Hezbollah and Syria are all trying to manage, trying to prevent this absolute, which is going to be devastating, escalation. And that's why now Syria, for example, the Syrian Arab Army is trying to finally finish ISIS in the central desert area. They're negotiating with Iraq and Russia to normalize relations with Turkey. Russia and Turkey restarted the patrols of the M4 in the northwest because the army is preparing to move north and to basically take the M4 under their control so they have the access from Aleppo to Latakia. So to me, it looks like Syria is preparing for some kind of escalation. They're removing the threats internally that would be difficult to deal with if a confrontation with Israel does expand. So, there's a lot of maneuvering going on the ground that does suggest there is going to be an expansion of the conflict. But I don't think you're going to see a kind of a World War III scenario. I think we have a lower kinetic type of war now.
Like a 2006 style engagement. It happened in 2006 with the Israel-Lebanon war.
I think there's a big difference now. Because you've got, they're not only going to be dealing with Hezbollah, they're going to be dealing with the other resistant factions in Lebanon, they're going to be dealing with Iran, they're going to be dealing with all of the factions in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen. There's Afghani troops that it was being reported they're already in Syria, but they're not. But they're prepared to head off immediately if Lebanon is attacked. There's also factions inside the Gulf states that nobody's really talking about, but they're there. Right. So because the regimes have one policy, but the people generally are against that policy, because even though they're not fans, particularly of Iran or of Hamas or anything like that, but they are against normalization with Israel. So it's, yeah.
So you think Hezbollah will have more troops on their side and more support if there is an all-out war?
Yeah, absolutely, totally. I think the entire resistance axis would then be
that's true.
Involved. Yeah, I mean, everyone has made that statement. Everyone.
Oh,
Iraqi resistance have already said they will come to Lebanon. Ansarullah now has established a coordination room in Baghdad to work with the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which we know is multiple factions, including the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Forces, which of course was Abu Mahdi Mohandas' group. He was the leader of that are now incorporated into the Iraqi army. The Iraqi resistance are now sending a very clear message to the Iraqi government that they're dragging their heels on its following the US. So now they're going to start retargeting US bases, and they have done recently in the last few days. So you've got an entire army that would mobilize at that point, I think, because if it's not halted in Lebanon, then of course it spreads to Syria, Iraq, Iran, and that's the intention.
So I guess the real question is not who's going to step in to protect Hezbollah, but who's going to step in to protect Israel. So we have now the U.S. as the main linchpin in a massive escalation there, which then brings us back to the manipulation of the American public. And I think there seems to be a giant question as to whether we saw a false flag or a multi-layered psyop in Pennsylvania, and that we're supposed to believe that Trump and that to lead us to this huge escalation.
For me, it was without a doubt from the second it happened, and that's why I tweeted out almost immediately, this is a psyop. Like, honestly, if you're falling for this, you're stupid.
I agree.
Right? And I mean, I just got kind of absolutely shot down, and in fact, because UK Column that I do news with, they received quite a few emails going, oh, so UK Column thinks it's a psyop. And Mike called me up, he said, oh, it was you. I said, like, yeah, because it's so, it's so obvious to me.
So obvious.
Why this happened.
Like, the details aren't, but, like I said, you can come up with very good explanations for it, but it's like, you have to be just totally blind or have some kind of trauma to not be willing to accept that this is just manipulation based on what we saw. I don't have any.
Well, and we've been manipulated for so many years, and I just can't quite believe that people still haven't learned to take a step back, take a deep breath, and think it through a little bit. before reacting.
Yeah, because that's probably a lot more comfortable to just believe what's on the
Yeah, I
surface.
guess, and just react. And the thing is that what I find quite disturbing is they're willing to be triggered to react in normally a very kind of negative way. You know, whether it's the Ukraine war, an immediate knee-jerk reaction which led to Russophobia, basically, right? Or against Iran, or against China, or against Syria. And, you know, Syria still gets it in the neck because of the propaganda that began sort of before 2011. And Assad is still considered a mass murderer by those people that supported the regime change war. So it's very difficult to change minds once that manipulation has come into play. That's the problem. Same with the COVID project.
Yeah, COVID's a great 9/11's a good example too, because as far as I know, there's been no updates to any building regulations to prevent buildings from falling into their own footprint due to a small fire in one office, as happened in Building 7. There's been no updates to building codes. So if that's what happened, and we're supposed to believe that's exactly what happened, and we're not questioning it, and there's no other option, then we should update building codes, and we should make buildings like, I mean, every building in America apparently is every cement, steel, and reinforced concrete building in America is susceptible to like someone throwing their cigarette into a waste paper basket, and the whole building falling down like a comedy. That's supposed to be the reality, and yet nothing's been updated. So I'd like to know now, are like the president and the people protected by the Secret Service, are they pushing for an update to security regulations to make it less of a clown show? And I don't think they are. So I think that's the best evidence.
No, because the security will target the people. It won't target the security services or anything like that. You'll have, like I said, another Patriot Act where you are going to be searched more than before, where your name is going to be, you know, in some kind of AI hub where they can check on your thought patterns and what you're doing and cut off your finance supply and all the rest of it. Yeah, but the security services aren't going to get affected.
That's true, but you would think that if you were, like, I don't know, one of the Congress people or whatever who relies on not being assassinated by these same goons, that you would expect some kind of federal regulation update or something, or some people resigning so that you yourself felt safe. But I don't think, just like there's plenty of people in high-rise buildings made by the same specs as Building 7 or the Twin Towers, who are just, they have no anxiety living or working in those buildings. For some reason, even though we were told how flimsy these things are by the official narrative, like, we know in this case those security services are clownish. We saw them on video. If that's true, that's how clownish they are, there needs to be real. I mean, they should hire some Russians to come teach them how to be secure. So absolutely,
I know.
Anyway,
it's we are living in a very kind of bizarre dimension. Well, I feel like we're living in about 6 or 7 different dimensions, actually. It's like I try to keep myself in the real life one rather than in these bubbles that they're creating. It's very
that's why I like having you on the show. So.
Oh, thank you. I always love talking to you too.
No, that's about it. Thanks so much for coming and talking to us about all those different stuff. And I always learn a lot whenever we talk to you. Like, it's amazing conversation and a lot of information. So thank you.
No, thank you both. It's always a real pleasure talking to you guys. Thank you.
Well, next time we'll have you on and we'll talk about dogs. That sounds
That's a better topic. Yeah.
Yeah. I prefer my dogs to most humans, actually.
Yeah, I can understand that. All right. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Toy Stole Tales. We will see you again next time we do an episode. Take care. Be sure to like and subscribe. All right.